Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into the hidden world inside every single bottle of beer, wine, and spirits. We're going to literally peel back the label to see what it actually takes to get that beverage into your glass. And trust me, the financial and operational risks these companies face to keep the drinks flowing are pretty surprising.
So, what's the true cost of the drink in your hand? Well, it's a question that goes way, way beyond the price tag you see at the store or your local bar. We're talking about an incredibly complex environmental and social footprint. It's a journey that stretches all the way from the soil where the ingredients are grown, right down to the final sip. And yep, even what happens to the empty bottle after you're done. To actually figure this out, investors rely on a super strict playbook, the SASB standards, which are now under the stewardship of the IFRS Foundation. Think of this as the ultimate guide to translating a company's environmental footprint directly into its financial health. It gives us the rigorous, standardized metrics we need to track all those hidden costs. Okay, let's dive into this. The sheer scope of the metrics these beverage companies have to track is honestly staggering. And why is that? Well, it's because of how the industry is built. We're talking about massive global portfolios dealing with varying levels of vertical integration. A local winery, they stay put and navigate one set of local rules. But a global brewer? They might own dozens of scattered manufacturing facilities just to navigate different regional regulations and get access to local markets. Tracking sustainability across that vast, globally integrated web is a totally monumental task. To make sense of it all, we're going to follow the life cycle of a drink across 4 distinct phases. We'll start with sourcing ingredients, then look at energy and water risks, move on to the packaging life cycle, and finally, wrap up with responsible drinking. All right, phase 1. This is where the life cycle begins, sourcing those raw ingredients. Look, before you can brew or distill anything, you need agricultural inputs, right? Things like barley, corn, and sugar. But here's the catch. These crops are highly vulnerable to climate change and shifting weather patterns. Companies track this risk by zeroing in on their Tier 1 suppliers. Those are the farms they transact with directly. They're actually required to disclose exactly how much of their supply comes from regions with high or extremely high baseline water stress. Because think about it, if a global brewer's main supplier runs dry, production literally grinds to a halt and costs skyrocket. But it's not just about water. It's about social responsibility too. Beverage companies constantly audit their suppliers, and they categorize issues into 2 main buckets, minor and major nonconformances. A minor nonconformance is usually just an isolated incident. Minimal risk, pretty easily fixed. But a major nonconformance, that is severe. We're talking about systemic breaches of the law, immediate environmental harm, or severe human rights violations like child labor. Failing to monitor and correct these creates massive regulatory risks that could totally derail an entire global brand. And when a major nonconformance is found, a ticking time bomb starts. These companies have exactly 90 days to complete a corrective action plan to eliminate the cause. Just 90 days. This really proves that supply chain compliance isn't just some passive reporting exercise you do once a year. It is an active, fast-paced requirement to keep operations running legally. So how do global brands survive all this? Well, by building really resilient partnerships across different regions. They mitigate risks by diversifying their supplier base so they aren't totally reliant on one vulnerable area. They also provide training on proper agrochemical application to protect the soil. They invest in alternative, climate-resilient crops, and they actively engage with suppliers on labor rights. It's a very hands-on global effort. Moving right along to phase 2. Now we're stepping inside the brewery and distillery to look at energy and water risks. Once the ingredients are harvested, transforming those crops into alcohol is an incredibly resource-intensive process. Now, what's really interesting here is the surprising fact about water use. Consumed water doesn't just mean the liquid that actually ends up in the bottle. Not at all. Companies are held to strict standards that track even the water that evaporates into thin air during withdrawal, use, and discharge. Literally every single drop has to be accounted for. On top of that, the quality of the water matters just as much as the quantity. The sustainability standard sets a very strict universal threshold here. Fresh water is defined as water containing less than 1,000 parts per million of dissolved solids. This universal metric is absolutely crucial. When a company has vertical integration across 30 different countries, they just can't rely on patchy local laws to accurately define water quality. They need one standard. Operating in areas where water is scarce means companies risk losing their social license to operate if they end up depleting local resources. To prevent this, they implement advanced water recycling and closed-loop systems to reuse water endlessly. They redesign products to require less water overall, and they take measures to reduce aquatic impingements. That's really just a technical way of saying they make sure local fish and wildlife aren't getting trapped in their water intake pipes. Energy is the other massive input here, and you can't just slap a green energy label on a giant manufacturing facility and call it a day. To legally claim renewable energy use, companies must maintain a rigorous paper trail of renewable energy certificates or guarantees of origin. They literally have to retain or replace these certificates to prove they are genuinely greening the grid, not just greenwashing their operations. Okay, on to phase 3, the packaging life cycle. Let's talk about the cost of the container. So now the beverage actually needs to be bottled or canned. Even if beverage companies don't manufacture their own packaging, they totally own the reputational risk if those bottles end up littering a beach somewhere. And claiming packaging is sustainable requires navigating some incredibly strict definitions. For instance, recycled material has already been reprocessed into a final component. Recovered material, on the other hand, is simply trash saved from a landfill to be reused as an input. This level of rigorous reporting ensures companies aren't faking their sustainability efforts. To manage these risks, companies focus heavily on optimizing the package itself. And shaving just a few grams off a glass bottle doesn't just help the earth. It drastically cuts heavy transportation costs across a massive global supply chain. They also utilize alternative materials, increase compostable content, and rely on comprehensive life cycle assessment analysis to scientifically prove that their changes are actually better for the planet. Finally, we arrive at phase 4. Responsible drinking and the social impact of the consumer. So, the crucial point is that a brand's responsibility doesn't just magically end at the cash register. Irresponsible consumption leads to massive social externalities, which very often translate directly into costly lawsuits and strict regional taxes for the companies. Because of this, marketing is heavily scrutinized. Companies must rigorously track demographic data to mathematically prove their advertising impressions are actually hitting consumers at or above the legal drinking age, no matter what region they're operating in. But they can't just play defense. They also have to play on the offense. Companies invest heavily in educating parents and youth, running high-profile campaigns against drinking and driving, and warning against the effects of binge drinking. They even engage directly with retailers in person to make sure bartenders and store clerks are actually checking IDs. These proactive steps are absolutely essential for mitigating social harm, which in turn limits their liability across all those wildly diverse regional markets. And that brings us to the end of the life cycle. When you look at all of this, the water stress data, the supplier audits, the strict packaging definitions, and the marketing metrics, it becomes super clear that evaluating a global beverage brand requires looking far past the label. It requires really diving into the data. So I'll leave you with this to think about. Does your favorite beverage brand truly account for its hidden costs from soil to sip? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Until next time, stay curious and keep looking at the data.